everyone. Thank you for joining us for AO Trauma North America's Orthopedic Trauma Journal Club series. Tonight, we'll be discussing non-unions.
So I'm Jason Strelzo. I'm an orthopedic traumatologist here at the University of Chicago. And it's my pleasure to introduce and discuss with Dr. Malcom Smith the paper of his called A Unified Theory of Bone Healing and Non-Union, the BHN theory, published in the Bone and Joint Journal in 2016. So Malcom, thanks for spending your evening with us and discussing this paper. Maybe tell us a little about yourself and where this paper kind of started.
Thank you, Jason. So I'm Malcom Smith. I'm also an orthopedic traumatologist currently at UMass in Worcester, although I spent a long time down in Boston. Initially trained in the UK, as I'm sure you all realise. So the paper was a concept that came out of some meetings in the UK. The primary idea was David Elliott, but you'll see a lot of people are named on the paper and a lot of them contributed a great deal. Essentially, we just challenged ourselves one night after a meeting to try and understand and be able to present the philosophy and bone healing process better. And that went right through to developing a full theory of bone healing and non-union, just see presented in the paper.
I suggest I show you a PowerPoint that introduces the whole thing, and then we can ask questions based on that. So this paper was published in 2016. Although I wrote it primarily with Chris Moran, I was not the initiator of the whole thing. And the majority of the ideas began with Dave Elliott and probably Kevin Newman, really. What happened was that there's a very good meeting in the UK called the Nottingham Fracture Forum. It ended up with us talking about David's concept of purely mechanical theories of non-union and how bone healing works, and challenging ourselves to think about it in a different way. And that thought process led to some diagrams and an understanding that I'm going to show you now, and led to this paper. The paper was presented as consideration of a theory. It's the same way physics theory is put out there for people to think about and discuss. It's not based on hard data. It's based on human understanding of what we see every day. So BHN stands for Bone Healing and Non-Union Theory. These are the basic concepts that we came out. Normal practicing surgeons look at and watch bone healing all the time in our normal practice. The overall concept is that healthy broken bone heals. It forms bone, it heals, then it remodels. David introduced a concept called the bone healing organ. In the paper, it was called the bone healing unit because the reviewers refused to accept the term organ, but it's an organ, right? It's the bone healing organ. And the concept is that the bone healing organ is specifically identifiable. It itself is biologically active. It heals the fracture, and it does so by responding to the strain. The diagrams you're going to see just help in that understanding. When we internally fix fractures, we clearly do so without damaging that basic biology. That's what biological fixation is. But what we technically do is we change the strain over the fracture. We put it in place and we alter the local strain. And I think you'll see how this concept lets you see what actually happens when we do our surgeries. The bit highlighted in red is what illustrates the non-union is. In a non-union, the concept is that the bone healing organ is still intact. It's not dead. It is responsive, and it will change its action based on how you reapply the strain. Most people go through this atrophic and hypertrophic thing. We do not believe in that philosophy at all. Non-unions are either biological or mechanical, and across the board, mechanical vastly dominates. A biological non-union is an extremely rare thing. I'm not talking about defects here. Defects are different. Non-unions and defects are different things. The whole concept follows Stephan Perrin's understanding of how different tissues form with different degrees of strain. If you apply strain to tissue, granulation tissue will form strains 100%. A tissue lengthening by its own length, getting twice as long. As the strain goes down, different tissues can form. Fibrous tissue 20%, cartilage can lengthen 10%, and bone, if it can lengthen at all, can lengthen no more than 2%. Above 2% of strain, bone can't form. If you then look at a graph where you have bone formation in the green and bone resorption in the red, and put it against strain, and concentrate on that area down there, we challenged ourselves to illustrate it graphically, and that paper does. This is the graph we came up with. Essentially, above this level, it's too much strain, you can't form bone. In this zone, bone's formed. Below this zone, you have normal homeostasis where our bones are sitting every day, all the time. But if you work hard, they'll form more bone. If you stop doing things, they'll resolve bone. That's where Wolff's law normally works. That's normal remodeling. It's shown in more detail in the paper. And below this level, bone is resolved because there's enough strain on it. This is the old lady in bed, it's the astronaut in space. This is where there's not enough pressure on the bone. So then what we're aiming to do is get the bone into this zone so that it will heal. And all fracture healing does is it reduces the local strain around the fracture so that the tissues get into a level where bone will form. So it goes from more strain to less strain and brings the fracture healing. It just does this till eventually get to a position where it will normally remodel the bone. If you think what we do with surgery, right, we're looking at that 2% zone. There's a fracture that's healed, and it's got a plate on. It's under a free flap, as you can see. There's a plate on. It's got no callus under where the screws are. A little bit of callus here, and a lot of callus here. There's very little strain there, a bit more strain there, and more strain here. Basically, this is absolute stability towards this end of the spectrum. This is stability in the bone healing zone. Up here, it's too high, it will not form bone. So relative stability sits in this spectrum, and absolute sits down here. And that's what we're doing when we put a plate on bone. Non-union, which is where we're getting to with this session tonight, is basically, I think, nearly always mechanical failure. The fracture is trying to get down to that zone where it will form bone, and for some reason, it fails to get into this zone and stays up here. Typical non-union, this is a common unit femur, treated with what is actually quite a flexible, old-fashioned nail. You will see most of the fragments heal in, and quite typically the strain has come down. It's forming bone in some zones, but fail to form in one coming through here. And it ends up sitting here for one part of the fracture, which leads to the non-union. We're surgeons, we see this all the time, and what you will see is these non-unions and common unit fractures are almost universally uniplanar. Only one zone fails to heal because the strain is spread out all these fragments initially. They all heal in, and they fail to heal when the strain is now concentrated at one level. It becomes too high for that level to form bone. You get an oblique planar non-union. And nearly always is oblique because the strain is concentrated at a shear level, which is higher than that. And there's some more papers written since then that show how the non-union plane tends to concentrate in the oblique level. And that's it. It's about understanding the bone healing organ and how it graphically works and how it doesn't work.
I think there's two things that we talked about just before we started recording that I think are worthwhile bringing up. One being, if you are approached with a fracture or a non-union, what do you do with that existing callus? Because it's, you'll hear two sides of the coin. Some people say, I take all the callus out. And then obviously based on the paper here, I think the suggestion is probably not to do that and really just address the mechanical side of things. Maybe touch on that for us a little bit.
So since we wrote this and we thought it through more, the concept that was presented to me was not to take the non-union out. It's not the callus, right? The callus around the area are different to the non-union itself. I think that the spectrum of non-union from as cartilaginous non-union, which is a white oblique line that you'll see across the fracture zone, to a fibrous zone that moves a little bit, to a synovial non-union where the strain is so high that the bone healing organ in that area has been destroyed. If there's an intact tissue bridge between the two ends of the non-union, I do not take it out. I utilize the anatomy of the fracture. If it's oblique, I want to put a live screw across that area and put a plate to neutralize it and compress it. If it's more transverse, which is very rare, I'm going to use a big, heavy steel plate. The heavier it is, the better it is. It's always steel, never titanium because it's stiffer, and the non-unions invariably heal. If there's a synovial non-union and the tissue where the non-union gap has been destroyed by extra strain, then you've got to remake the bone organ. You curette and go through the cortical edge of the non-union site break it down, make it bleed again, and then put it back together again and treat it like a primary fracture.
I guess one final question for you would really be taking this theory and moving forward with it. Where would you like to see the sort of the next iterative steps?
The paper was offered as a theory, and at the end of the paper, it ended with, "Please stimulate interest and discussion." And I was a corresponding author. I got one reply from the whole world, and that was from China. I was very surprised because every time I presented it, it's been really well received, but it never generated the amount of debate I thought it would do. It needs data showing results of mechanical treatment only. There's quite a lot of that come out already. You've heard of bob screws?
Maybe for the people that are on the call today that don't know the Henley screw, can you maybe describe that and sort of describe the use or the uses of that technique?
The nickname is bob screws after a surgeon called Bob Henley, who basically described percutaneous fixation and non-unions. If you've got a non-union that's actually stable with an implant in ready, so it has to be actually stable, and locked nail, and it fails to heal, and there's an oblique non-union, then if you just do percutaneous screw fixation around the nail, lining up the screws to try and make them as lag screws or even Bob says position screws, but I prefer a lag screw to try and reduce the strain over the non-union side, then 75-80% of patients will then go to heal it without doing a big invasive procedure. Although Bob presented that the healing rate with his technique was in the high 90% range, that's not been mine. And overall, looking back at all my non-unions, and I used to do quite a lot, the more heavier you fix them, the better they do. If you use an exchange nail technique, I think you're looking at 70-80% of them getting better. If you put a big plate on, then 95% of them plus get better. The stiffer you make them, the better they do. Now, it depends, of course, on what the patient wants to have done, how invasive they want the procedure to be, because you've got to do a fairly invasive procedure to make them really stiff.
Well, that was really informative. I appreciate the time you took this evening to review the paper and the concepts involved, and looking forward to the question period coming up here.